The goal of this lesson is to help you develop a strategy for using typography effectively in Figma and in your daily role as a product designer. I know type can be a bit of a black box sometimes, but it's another one of those things that can be quite repeatable and systematic once you know the right way to approach it. Let's dive in. When we're talking about a typography system, what I'm referring to is really a set of text styles in Figma that you can use every single time there's a piece of text in your designs. And if you're always using text styles, that's a great way to ensure that your designs are going to map very nicely to the typography components that your developers have built out in code. So let's take an actual look at an example style guide that I'm working off of right now. And you can see that I have two sets of text styles. One is for desktop and tablet, and the other is for mobile. Now, depending on how established the product you're working on is, you might have more. Maybe there's one specifically for tablet, or maybe you even have 4 different text styles, and that's totally okay. The same principles apply. You're going to have this parent level object is going to be the breakpoint of that text style group. And so for web, then we're going to have headings, paragraphs, labels, and buttons. And you might have different groupings, but honestly, for 95+% of the products that I design, these 4 groups stay consistent. And if we break these open, in headings, we're going to have H1 through H6, paragraphs, P1 through P4, and these actually go one level deeper because we want to define the default italic and bold styles for each one. And then we also have the same kind of naming taxonomy for labels and buttons. Now, you might work on a team that prefers more prescriptive names like large title, subtitle, subtext, things like that. That's totally fine. Personally, I like the numbers and having a little bit more of an open-ended naming structure, and that's okay. Either works. Now that we have an idea of where we're headed, we know that we're going to create a system that looks something like this here. Let's talk about how we actually build this out, because our starting point is always the same. We're going to start by defining a type scale, and all that a type scale is it's a multiplier that's applied to the base unit of 16 pixels that determines how much bigger each concurrent piece of text is. So a really common one would be 1.2, and this works well for products and mobile apps and things like that. You can see here we have 16 pixels, and all we're doing is multiplying that by 1.2 and by 1.2 and by 1.2. And depending on the size of your type scale, maybe it's 1.2, maybe it's as big as 1.5. That's going to dictate the discrepancy between font sizes and ultimately how big your H1 is going to be. Now, there are some common ones, and I've actually linked at the bottom of this slide my favorite type scale generator that can take care of the entire process for you. But the important thing to know is that the type scale that we choose is going to be dependent on the product that we're creating. If we're creating something like a website, we might want a really large vertical rhythm, which is just the size difference between our fonts. Because think about it, when you go to like an agency site, for instance, you're going to have a really, really, really big headline first thing that you read. And so you need this type scale to be at least 1.33, maybe even 1.5, depending on how over the top that you want to get. Conversely, if we're designing a mobile app, we know that we don't really want that large font to be much bigger than maybe even 32 pixels. And so we're going to choose a much smaller type scale, and our vertical rhythm is going to be more condensed, which means there's going to be less of a difference between each individual size. Before we move on, one important thing to note, you don't have to stay exactly to this type scale. In fact, I actually recommend not doing that, because a type scale is a lot of the times going to generate some pretty nasty numbers. You don't want to be using 33.18 pixels for a font size. That's insanity. I'll almost always use this as a starting point and then round my numbers here to the nearest 4 pixels so that everything fits nicely on my grid. So this might be 40 pixels, 32, 28, 24, 20. You get the idea. One of the most important elements of having a refined typography system is nailing your line height. And there's actually a pretty good system that we can use to make sure that we get the right line heights for each of our individual text elements. Before we get into the exact process, there's a couple high-level ideas that I like to bake into the method, and that is that headings almost always should have tighter line heights than paragraphs. And that really comes down to just making sure that paragraphs are easier to read and that headings, which are typically larger, are not taking up too much space within our designs. The other thing is that as a heading increases in size, the relative line height should decrease just a little bit. So the way that I make sure that I'm getting the right numbers here, and that also I have a consistent look and feel throughout my entire typography system, is I'll use a multiplier. And my multiplier for headings is almost always 1.2. I might change that a little bit, especially if I'm deviating away from more basic fonts, but for most of interface design, 1.2 works great. And all that means is I'm taking 74 times 1.2, and you can see that gives me 88.8. Which brings me to the next part of the process. We absolutely do not want decimals. That is going to be such a headache when we're thinking about our designs. And on top of that, I also will round to the nearest 4 pixels. And that way, the type always is going to fit neatly on my grids. So in this case, I have 88. Because this is H1, I'm going to err a little bit on the side of a tighter line height because it is so big. And so I actually will shrink this down to 84. And if we do that one more time here, which you can see the math, I'm not going to do it every time, but 56.1.2 is 67.2. We definitely don't want that, but I definitely like the idea of having 64 pixels, which is going to fit on my grid. And if we do that for each one of our headings, we're going to end up with a really nice, cohesive set of headlines that look good every single time. And most importantly, they're going to be a joy to work with, and even your developers are going to like them because everything's going to fit very nicely on our grid. Now, if we take that method and apply it to paragraphs, it works similarly, only we want our paragraphs to be more breathable. We want more space in between our lines because a lot of times there might be 4 to 20 different lines of text. And so legibility is the most important thing with paragraphs. If you leave the line height to auto, it's not going to look good. It's going to be too condensed every single time. Instead, the multiplier that I use for paragraphs is 1.5. And in this case, a lot of the times it's automatically going to fall really nicely on my grid. And so if I'm using 32 pixels, 24, 18, and 13, you can see that this is going to work really, really well. I don't actually have to make significant rounding until I get to this 27 and 20. If you'll notice, these numbers look pretty familiar, right? I have 32, 24, and 18. And that is definitely intentional. And I want it to match up with this 32, 24, and 18 here. And that's something that I try to do on pretty much every typography system that I create. I want at least 2 and maybe even 3 of the paragraph fonts to overlap with the font sizes of the headings. Why? Well, a couple reasons. One is, in general, we should be trying to minimize the amount of font sizes that we're using on any given piece of UI. It's going to make things much more clean and generally less overwhelming. The second reason is it makes it really easy to pair those 2 fonts together. A lot of times these situations will arise where we're going to want to put them in a single row or very closely together or something like that. And having multiple points of overlap in terms of font size between my headings and paragraphs becomes really, really useful as all of these different UI use cases come to light. To wrap up our discussion of line height, we still have 2 groups of fonts left. We have our buttons and our labels. And we're going to cover these together because they are by far the easiest. Why? Because our line heights for buttons and labels are always going to be set to 100%. The reason being that these 2 types of text by nature don't go onto multiple lines. Buttons are 1 line, labels are 1 line. And so we don't have to worry about the vertical space in between lines of text. Instead, what we're going to optimize for is optical alignment. We want to make it very easy to place this piece of text closely with other UI elements. And it gets a little bit more difficult when you have all of this excess padding baked into the font size itself based off of the line height. So this is what a paragraph looks like. This is that 1.5 multiplier. It's pretty significant. And you really couldn't get something even closer than this bounding box unless you wanted to get a little bit hacky with negative margins and things like that. We don't want to do that. Instead, we're going to set this to 100% and keep this as tight as possible to the piece of text itself. And that way, it's going to be much easier to align this with maybe a form or an input underneath it, like a label, or within some kind of a button. Next up, we're going to cover the science of letter spacing. Again, this is one of those things that can be very ambiguous, but in reality, there actually is a very systematic process that we can use to make it look good every time. The disclaimer is, if you're using really wacky out there fonts, these rules might not apply as strictly, and you got to kind of treat those on a case-by-case basis. But again, for 90+% of product design, we're dealing with more basic fonts, and this is going to work great. Now, the 3 rules of thumb that I abide by when it comes to letter spacing. First, headings have tighter letter spacing. And this makes sense, right? Because they're much bigger. And so in the same way that we'd want to condense the line height, we're going to condense the letter spacing. Second, paragraph letter spacing should always be left default. And that's because we want to optimize for legibility. Don't touch it. Third, labels have much looser spacing. This really makes sense if we're using caps case labels. I would be a little bit less comfortable messing with the letter spacing if we were not using caps case, but a lot of times caps case looks wonderful as a label, and I really do like to widen it just a little bit. It makes it easier to read and also gives it a unique flair. So let's do a quick side-by-side here, and we can look at 2 examples and kind of just see the difference. So this is the default letter spacing, and right away you can see how the caps case label feels somewhat cramped. It's a little bit hard to read, and if we compare it to this label down here, look at how much nicer that looks, more spread out. All I've done is taken the letter spacing and bump it up to 5%. Next, let's look at this heading. Really subtle difference. All I've done is decreased the letter spacing by 2%, and it really does tighten things in a way that makes the design look much more crisp, and it creates a nice juxtaposition with this increased letter spacing of the labels. So this combination right here, I do almost every time. It's such an easy way to enhance the visual side of our typography, and all it takes is following those 3 simple rules outlined in the slide. We're going to wrap it up with 3 points on the science of font weight. First off, very simple. For paragraph fonts, unless you really are trying to go out there and maybe have a more chunky look and feel, leave the font weight to 400. It just works better. It's much easier to read. I know sometimes we think that these thin 300 fonts look better. It's almost always a worse user experience. Unless you have a very good reason, you should keep the font weight to 400. Second, buttons and labels almost always should be just a little bit heavier of a font weight than your paragraphs. And this just allows you to create a little bit of a hierarchy and a little bit of a visual separation between those 2 text elements. So you can see here that even though these are the same font size, that white label pops just a little bit, and that's what we're looking for. And you can combine that with a decreased level of contrast. So you can see right here, I'm using 90% opacity, and that combined with this font weight is going to allow you to create hierarchy without having to introduce an unnecessary second font size. On that same note, almost every time I will use a medium or a semi-bold button depending on what the font gives me. And that's the same reason. I want this to just feel a little bit different than all of my paragraph text as a way to help it stand out. Okay. The other idea is that most of the time with my headings, I will become progressively less bold as my font size decreases. So for something like H1 and most of the time H2, I'll almost always use an actual bold. As I get down to H3, H4, H5, I'll probably bump that down to semi-bold just because the font sizes are getting smaller. So I want them to be a little bit less chunky so that it's easier to read. And if you take that logic all the way down to H6, this is getting close to functioning as subtext even. And so I really want to err on the side of legibility. So I'll make that a 500 font weight. And that way I know that it's going to be easy to read even at a smaller font size. Before I let you go, I want to give a quick note of encouragement on font pairings. Font pairings are hard. And all the time I see people talk about how they don't know how to pair different fonts, and there's almost this negative stigma around using Google fonts even. And I want to say quickly that that is okay. I would not consider myself an expert at all in the science of font pairings, and it hasn't impacted my career at all. In fact, there are so many really good resources, and I've linked a few of my favorites down here that I can go to for pretty much every project and know that it's going to work well. These are the two fonts for Figma Academy. I've gotten complimented on them a lot, and I just pulled them off of Font Pair. Simple as that. So don't feel like you have to be able to think really out of the box and try these different font combinations that nobody has done before. If you feel comfortable in that, great, go for it. But as product designers, it is totally okay to pull from these types of websites and use those to build out these typography systems. There's a reason that popular fonts are popular. They're tried, they're tested, and they'll probably work pretty well for your project.